Nobody wants CBDCs. Study after study has shown that the voluntary adoption of these dystopian digital currencies will be low, and a recent survey by the Cato Institute found that only 16% of Americans support a CBDC. The survey also identified why most Americans oppose a CBDC, why some of them support it, and even how to convince those supporters to change sides. So today I'm going to summarise this survey, explain why people support or oppose CBDCs, and tell you how you can change someone's mind about this sensitive topic. This is a video you don't want to miss. The survey I'll be summarising today is aptly titled, quote, "Poll: Only 16% of Americans support the government issuing a central bank digital currency." It was published by the Cato Institute late last month, and if it sounds familiar, that's because presidential candidate Ron DeSantis tweeted about it. Now, the survey starts by explaining that central banks around the world, including the Federal Reserve, are exploring CBDCs. For those unfamiliar, CBDCs could allow governments and central banks to determine what you can buy, when you can buy it, where you can buy it, and even how much money you can save. Not surprisingly, most people are skeptical of CBDCs, including most Americans. The survey's authors explain that the key difference between CBDCs and existing digital payment methods like credit cards is that the former is a liability of the central banks and the latter is a liability of the commercial banks. Now, this is more significant than you think because even though commercial banks can also restrict your payments and savings, you can simply switch to another commercial bank that doesn't do that. In a CBDC system, there is no other bank you can switch to if you want to retain your financial freedom. Obviously, this is not something that the average person understands. In fact, the authors found that only 28% of Americans are familiar with CBDCs. As a result, almost half of respondents didn't have an opinion about them. Of the ones that did, 16% said they support CBDCs and 34% said they oppose them. What's fascinating is that Republican voters appear to be more informed about CBDCs than Democrat voters, but only slightly. About a third of Republicans are familiar with CBDCs compared to about a quarter of Democrats. This might have something to do with CBDCs becoming a culture war issue on the right. This would explain why Democrats are twice as likely to support a CBDC than Republicans, 22% versus 11% respectively. It could also explain why Democrats are often anti-crypto and Republicans are often pro-crypto. It seems that one political party will oppose what the other supports, regardless of the practical effects. That said, the authors found that more than half of Democrats don't have a strong opinion about CBDCs and that almost a quarter oppose them. Meanwhile, more than half of Republicans oppose CBDCs. What matters at the end of the day is that there's more overall opposition than support from both sides. The authors also examined differences in CBDC opinions among different genders and ethnicities. Oddly enough, men are twice more likely than women to support CBDCs, 22% versus 11%. Almost a third of African Americans support a CBDC, and almost a third of Americans under 30 support CBDCs too. Now, the next section of the survey concerns the connections between CBDCs and the government. For context, in theory, central banks and governments are independent of each other. In practice, central banks have become more politicized, and in many countries they are synonymous with the government. The authors found that most Americans would oppose a CBDC if the government could control how they spend, 74%, if the government could see how they spend, 68%, if the government eliminated cash for a CBDC, 68%, if there was an increased risk of cyber attack, 65%, if governments could force them to spend during a recession, 64%, and if the government used it to freeze the bank accounts of protesters, 59%. Now, if you watched our recent digital euro update, you'll know that central banks have a way of bending definitions to make it sound like they won't do any of the above. In the case of the ECB, they effectively renamed programmable payments to conditional payments. Both will control how you spend. And if you watched our previous digital euro update, you'll know that central banks essentially need to eliminate cash to achieve CBDC adoption. This is exactly what's been happening in Nigeria. The central bank there restricted cash to force the adoption of its e-naira. It's reportedly starting to work. The worst part is that the cyber attack risk is very real. In fact, this seems to be the reason why larger central banks, such as the Fed, aren't rushing their CBDC rollouts. They need to make sure their CBDC networks are impossible to hack and immune to next-generation technologies like quantum computing. Now, forcing people to spend during a recession is also something that central banks have admitted that they want to do, and freezing the bank accounts of protesters is something that's already been done. The most famous example is that of the pandemic protests in Canada early last year, and it's not the only one. As I've mentioned many times before, financial freedom doesn't mean having a lot of money. It means having the ability to spend your money however you want, with whomever you want. This is something that Democrats and Republicans are hyper aware of. Both strongly oppose CBDCs with capital controls. Now, the authors point out that Democrats are slightly more comfortable with the government seeing all CBDC transactions, just so long as they don't start controlling those transactions. What these folks fail to realise is that it's a slippery slope from the former to the latter. Thankfully, opposition to surveillance is still 61%. Another peculiar political finding is that Democrats don't mind if a CBDC causes commercial banks to go under. Only 40% would oppose a CBDC in this case. By contrast, almost 3/4 of Republicans would oppose a CBDC that causes small commercial banks to go out of business, and rightfully so. Besides the fact that small and medium-sized banks serve small and medium-sized businesses, the big banks happen to be the legal owners of the Federal Reserve via their stakes in its regional Fed banks. This is something that's easy to forget, but it's important to remember because big banks want as much consolidation as possible. In other words, big banks want the small and medium-sized banks to go under so they can acquire them and continue to grow. It's possible that the Fed's monetary policy is being influenced by this financial incentive, and it's conceivable that CBDCs are being designed to ensure this consolidation occurs. Take a second to consider that the Fed's upcoming FedNow payment system will make bank runs that much easier. That's because it will be possible to instantly wire money out of small and medium-sized banks and into big banks. Custodia Bank CEO Caitlin Long is one of many who's been warning about this. Anyways, the authors also assessed what makes CBDCs so appealing to some Americans. They found that 42% would support a CBDC if it were used to combat illicit financial activity, 40% would support it if it were used to ensure that welfare payments were actually spent on essentials, 33% would support it if it were used to bank the unbanked, and 32% would support it if it were used to prevent recessions. As you might have noticed, support for these supposed benefits is not very high. Not only that, but the primary benefit, that of fighting financial crime, is unlikely to be achieved under a CBDC system. If you've watched any of our videos about the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, you'll know that it is in charge of fighting illicit financial activity around the world. You'll also know that its so-called recommendations haven't reduced illicit financial activity according to its own statistics. To add insult to injury, up to 1/3 of all illicit financial activity is believed to occur within the borders of the United States, and yet it's countries like the United Arab Emirates that end up on the FATF's naughty lists. This just goes to show you that people can't police themselves because people are corruptible. Put simply, illicit financial activity would probably continue in a CBDC system because the people in charge of the CBDC system would have the power to ensure it continues. Look no further than the banking system for evidence of that. The largest and most compliant banks get the biggest fines. And make no mistake, the same is true when it comes to ensuring that welfare payments are spent on what they're supposed to be spent on. There will always be a way of gaming the system. All this supposed benefit will do is set the stage for the government to control every single transaction. Now, the author's findings suggest that Democrats aren't aware of this. More than half of them support CBDCs being used to reduce illicit financial activity, preventing recessions and banking the unbanked. Republican opposition to these benefits far outweighs any support. Anywho, the next section of the survey takes a closer look at the perceived risks and benefits of CBDCs. The authors found that more than 3/4 of Americans are more concerned about the real risks, whereas less than 1/4 of Americans are more concerned about the supposed benefits. Notably, Republicans are significantly more concerned about the risks of CBDCs than Democrats. A whopping 85% of Republicans believe that the risks outweigh the benefits, but only 68% of Democrats feel the same way. Again, all that matters is that both sides generally agree that CBDCs are bad. Now, to their credit, the authors admit that these findings could have been different if they had given participants a different combination of benefits and risks. Something tells me that the findings would still lean in the same direction. Never mind that the list of supposed CBDC benefits is very short. Now, in terms of ideal CBDC benefits, Americans want a digital dollar to carry no additional costs, to preserve privacy, to be more secure than other payment methods, and to be easier to use. Funnily enough, the number one response to this question was none of the above. Nobody wants it. In terms of real CBDC risks, Americans don't want a digital dollar to control what they spend, to monitor how they spend, to censor their payments, or to abolish cash. It's basically the same list of risks that was mentioned earlier. I'm curious to know why 11% answered none of the above to this question. Anyhow, the next section of the survey explores what is arguably the most important part of a CBDC, and that's trust. If you watched our video about the upcoming online censorship laws, you'll know that trust in institutions of all kinds has been declining for decades and plummeted during the pandemic. Rather than act in ways that would make them more trustworthy, governments and central banks have opted to double down by labelling all opposition as disinformation, misinformation, and the like. This has been backfiring spectacularly, and the result is what you see. Nobody wants the damn CBDCs. If you watched our video about us getting fact-checked on Instagram, you'll know that governments and central banks have started targeting information about CBDCs in their online censorship campaigns. Fortunately, these campaigns have so far been fairly limited, hence why we can make this video. Unfortunately, there are still people out there who continue to trust central banks like the Fed, and the authors found that they support a CBDC rollout. They also found that people who reported being, quote, extremely familiar with CBDCs are in support of a digital dollar to the tune of 58%. Lo and behold, there is a large political difference. 84% of Democrats who are extremely familiar with CBDCs support a digital dollar. By contrast, 57% of Republicans who are extremely familiar oppose it. As you can see, the correlation between knowledge and opinion is extremely political. When it comes to adoption, 78% of respondents said that they would not use a CBDC if it was offered. Men are again almost twice as likely as women to support CBDCs. African Americans are again much more likely to adopt CBDCs than other ethnicities, and 40% of young people would adopt a CBDC. Yikes. On that note, the Bank for International Settlements, or BIS, the Bank for Central Banks, found that between 4 and 12% of people in developed countries would voluntarily adopt a CBDC. This is lower than the findings of this study, which suggest that as much as a fifth of people would voluntarily adopt CBDCs. But before CBDCs can be adopted, digital IDs will have to be rolled out. Now, if you watched our video on this very topic, you'll know that McKinsey found that the adoption of digital ID in developed countries is around 10%. This leads me to believe, or rather hope, that the voluntary adoption of CBDCs will be just as low. Now, when it comes to trust in institutions, 8 out of 10 Americans trust commercial banks more than the government, and the same percentage would prefer to bank with a commercial bank than the Fed. For once, the statistic applies to both political parties. Democrats don't trust the government either. To really drive the point home, the authors drop a crazy finding. Quote, CBDCs are about as popular as in-home government surveillance cameras. They then drop an even crazier statistic. 53% of the people who support CBDCs would support putting government cameras in your home. Well, not anyone on my Christmas card list, that's for sure. The authors conclude by reminding the reader that CBDCs are relatively new and that many Americans are either uninformed or don't have a strong opinion about them. Even so, early data suggests that those who are informed do have a strong opinion. CBDCs should not be permitted in the United States. The authors add that, quote, it is clear the idea does not have the majority support that government officials should seek before adopting a CBDC. Something tells me that most governments aren't going to care how much their citizens feel about central bank digital currencies. So, this brings me to the big question, and that's how you can change someone's mind when it comes to CBDCs. Well, the answer is education, actual education, not propaganda. To be blunt, too many people have been getting more of the latter than the former, particularly young people and men, apparently. This is probably because things like CBDCs have become politicized in recent years. It's possible that this politicization is a consequence of there not being much else that people can ground their personalities in. As a consequence, criticism of things like CBDCs is then perceived as a personal attack. In any case, it's clear that people take these kinds of issues personally. This makes propaganda very effective and education more difficult. It also means that you must be careful to make sure that your education isn't propaganda, because then it will just make the other side angrier, not more informed. The bad news is that there's been lots of propaganda about CBDCs from both sides. The good news is that we're still early enough in the CBDC discussion for both sides to be open to education. As the study has shown us, there are pros and cons to CBDCs that still need to be examined and understood. Right now, it looks like the cons far outweigh the pros, regardless of your perspective. The prospect that the government could control your every transaction is unappealing to everyone, regardless of their political leaning. But what if CBDCs do not have such qualities when they're released to the public? Based on our research, it's more than likely that most CBDCs will be benign when they begin. They'll just be another tab in your bank account where you pay your taxes and receive tax returns. Over time, it'll become harder to argue that the risks outweigh the benefits when the risks appear to be absent. And then there will be a crisis of some kind, and the government and central bank will announce some emergency measures, perhaps temporarily controlling what people can buy. By that point, everyone will be plugged into the system, and the temporary emergency measures will become a permanent feature. So, when you try to educate your friends and family about CBDCs in the coming years, start by acknowledging that yes, they will probably be a better alternative to existing payment systems when they start off. This will go over especially well with those who you know are pro-CBDC. Then, do your best to emphasize the fact that dystopian features can be introduced to CBDCs at any time without sounding like an unhinged conspiracy theorist. Luckily for you, the central banks have been open about how they want to control transactions with CBDCs. Show your friends and family the receipts. Finally, ask them whether there are any existing alternatives that could do a better job, such as cryptocurrencies. Explain that almost all cryptocurrency transactions are transparent and they can't be stopped by a centralized authority. Isn't that preferable to a closed, controlled payment system? After all, governments around the world are starting to use crypto for payments, and soon they could start using them for international trade. Come 2025, central banks could start holding cryptocurrencies on their balance sheets. So, if it's good enough for them, then surely it's good enough for us, right? You can learn more about that using the link in the description. And that's all for today's video, my friends. If you found it informative, smash that like button to let me know. Be sure to subscribe to the channel too and ping that notification bell to make sure you don't miss the next video. Whether you've been hodling through the recent crypto market crash or trying to trade it, the Coin Bureau deals page has something for you. We have some of the biggest discounts of over 50% and exchange bonuses of as much as $40,000 on offer. The link is down in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Until then, stay cool, stay safe, and stay crypto.